Hi, my name is Charlie Zigmond. I'm an accountant from Portland, Oregon, and I'm making this video just to demonstrate some of the things that you can use pivot tables to do and how you can better represent the data that you're working with. So for this video, I put together a little example of a workbook which contains dates, a list of products, and then the amount of units that were produced and scrapped for these imaginary product lines. I'm going to make a pivot table from it and just try to demonstrate some basic things you can do with your data. So the first thing that we want to do is that we're going to just go ahead and pull in the amount of units that were produced into the pivot table by dragging that field into the values section of the pivot table window. And from there we can see there were 403,600 units produced, and so we can go back to the data and see that we get that same number when we sum them manually, which just shows us that the pivot table is working as intended. And so, but obviously nothing too exciting yet. The next thing is we're going to go ahead and pull in the different products to show how many were produced on each of these. From that you can kind of start to see the story in the sense that product D is obviously a much less produced product than the other ones, and that wasn't really obvious to be able to tell from anything until we split it out by product. I moved it into the columns section to show that you can also format your table any way you want it. And then I moved it into the filters so that I could look at just one product at a time, or maybe a combination of products by selecting multiple items. The next thing I wanted to demonstrate is that you can pull the year into the report by dragging it into the rows section, and then Excel at that point tries to break the year down into a couple of different parts, quarters, months. But sometimes that's not even enough, because sometimes your problems go back to the days of the week or some other way of organizing the data. And so at this point what I've done is taken the quarters and put them up onto the columns, and then I've left the date as rows just to show how you can build a different layout. I want to demonstrate the part about using the weeks, and so what I do, and this is a common thing I do in a lot of these pivot tables, is that I go back to the date and then I use the various date part formulas to pull the relevant pieces of the date. So I'm pulling the month, I'm pulling the day, I'm pulling the year, and the weekday. They look like gibberish because Excel tries to format them as dates, but at this point they are actually just numbers. And so when I switch the format to be numbers, you can see they look a lot more reasonable. And those will now become things that we can organize our data by. So we're going to go ahead and name the table here. We'll go ahead and pull out all of the dates that we were using before and replace them with some of the other date parts. One thing I wanted to demonstrate was that you do have to hit refresh data in order to get the pivot table to understand that you've been adding things into the underlying data set. So you can see here I'm demonstrating the year split. Battery's running low, but that's going to be fine. And so yeah, so we've got our different parts of the date. We'll go ahead and pull weekday into the columns, so we can now see how many were produced for each product on each day of the week, and you can really start to see a trend. You can apply conditional formatting to the results of a pivot table to try to show even more what's going on, and so you can definitely see something happened in product B that caused production on days 1 and 2 to be lower. This would be a good time. You can also pull in the year as another layer to show whether or not that fact was true across multiple years, or whether that's just a newer trend. And yeah, so let's see, what's the next thing that we can demonstrate here? When you're working with pivot tables and you start pulling these fields in, sometimes the reports can get to be really overwhelming, and so you can right click on the rows and choose expand or collapse the entire field, and what that'll do is that'll close all of the different products or whatever you happen to have listed as your rows. And it's just kind of an easy way to group things and then be able to break them back out to individuals as you need to. For the next thing is that I wanted to show that you could bring in multiple values into your report, and so I've pulled now the sum of units scrapped into the report as well. I'm actively taking parts out just to see how it looks. Like if I take out the year, do I get a reasonable amount of units scrapped in relation to how many were produced? And one way to look at something like that is to build a formula into your data using a calculated field in which you give it a name, and then you can actually use the different columns that you create in the formula. So you can say something like units scrapped divided by units produced is going to be our scrap rate. But of course it wants to format those as dollars, and here we're working with percentages. So to do that, we're going to go into that value field, and then we're going to go into the number format and switch it to a percentage with 1 decimal place. That just gives us a feel that all of these are pretty consistent in terms of their scrap rate. So there's nothing we can really conclude there, but this would be a helpful way to show it if there were. We're going to now expand everything again, just to show whether or not the scrap rate was consistent by product and by year. Another really important thing to think about when working with pivot tables is that you can do math on the results of a pivot table, like I'm doing here, by just adding up 2 of the cells. But by default, when you try to do that, you're going to run into a problem unless you've already turned this option off, and it's called Generate GetPivotData. And what this option does is it's under the pivot table design window and then under pivot table, and it takes your formulas and it puts them in a format that is very explicit, that writes out the terms that you're using. So you can see sum of units scrapped is a term that's getting referenced there, and when you just use when you add the cells literally instead of the GetPivotData, you can copy it across. But if you have GetPivotData turned on, it will set all of your cells equal to the same formula that you use as you try to copy it across. And so that can be a really common thing that trips people up when working with pivot tables. Another thing that you can do with pivot tables is you can turn them into pivot charts, which just lets you show a visualization that changes as you change what's going on in the pivot table. This is a little bit outside of the scope of this video, but I just wanted to show that that option was there and what kind of a common usage of that option might look like. You can see as you play around with it, you can get some pretty crazy looking answers, but the nice thing is that because it's all done live, then it ends up being pretty quick and easy to see what works and doesn't work, and you can just kind of play with it and change it to your use case. In this case, this one looks really bad because it's too squished down, and so I've taken out the legend and I've made it a little bit bigger, and you can kind of see what's going on there. I think the years in that graph made it look hard to read, but that's the idea of how you can use pivot charts to display data. So yeah, this is just an introduction to pivot tables. There's a lot more that I could say about them, but it goes outside of the scope of this video. I think the last thing I just want to leave it on is that I want to bring up the idea that there is this add-on called PowerPivot, which lets you do more with pivot tables and work with larger data sets and work with multiple tables and define a data model that shows how they all connect. I may make a video on that later, but for the moment I just wanted to bring it to your attention. And yeah, thank you for listening.